In his explanation of the four beasts, the Lord made the point that the spirit and physical bodies of both man and beast were likenesses of each other. This means that the form and appearance of the physical bodies of both men and beasts resembled their spirits and vice versa. We know from the Book of Mormon that the spirit body of Jesus Christ, as seen by the brother of Jared, was in the likeness of the physical body he would later have in mortality. The Savior is using the archetype of the four beasts to teach the doctrine of the correspondence in appearance between the spirit and physical bodies of man and beast. The archetype of the four beasts, in turn, is derived from the four plasma streamers from Venus at one point in the development of the polar configuration. Earlier in Chapter 4, the plasma streamers of Venus were used to represent spirits, 7 in number. The 7 streamers, one of the many phases of Venus within the polar configuration, were the 7 spirits of God. At the same time, the plasma jets represented the 24 elders and the 4 beasts in their physical appearance. The streamers simultaneously represented both spirits and physical bodies. The Savior drew upon this symbolic duality to make his analogy about the exact correspondence in appearance between spiritual and physical bodies. In his explanation of the four beasts in answer to Joseph Smith's question, the Lord stated that the four beasts represented classes of beings. Since there were 4 beasts, this would mean there are 4 classes of beings, at least in the symbolic sense. Throughout the scriptures, when the animal kingdom is represented in general terms, this pattern of 4 classes of beasts is always followed. In the creation account of Genesis, animals are divided into 4 separate categories: fish of the sea, fowl of the air, cattle, and creeping things. The creation accounts of Moses and Abraham in the Pearl of Great Price follow the same pattern. In the Abraham account, when Adam is given dominion over the earth and all living things, the pattern is somewhat different. While the 4 classes are maintained, following the planetary archetype, creeping things and beasts are combined into one class, with Adam making the 4th class of animal. This follows the tetramorph of John, where one of the beasts had the face of a man. The beasts that entered into Noah's Ark to replenish the earth after the flood were also divided into 4 classes. In this case, the fish of the sea are replaced by the addition of cattle along with the beasts. When the Jaredites prepared for their voyage to the Promised Land, like Noah, they brought animal life with them in their barges. The account in Ether divides the animal cargo into 4 types, again following the mythic archetype. In this case, the bee replaced the creeping things of Genesis. The Apostle Peter was given a remarkable vision to persuade him to accept the Gentiles into the church. He saw a great sheet descend from heaven with various kinds of animals. The vision used the familiar archetype of the 4 classes of beasts. Like previous uses of the archetype, the structure of 4 categories was maintained, but there was a variation in the type of beasts within the structure. In the case of this vision, instead of fish, Peter saw wild beasts. Peter's vision is a more explicit version of the original planetary archetype. The vessel or sheet knit at the 4 corners is a symbolic representation of the sacred enclosure of the gods. The 4 plasma streamers of Venus divide the sacred enclosure into 4 sections, representing the domains of each class of animal. The 4 streamers represent the 4 corners, which intersect the circular enclosure and are thus tied or knitted. As would be expected, John uses the same mythic pattern later in his Apocalypse. Instead of differentiating the 4 classes of beasts by type, he does so by sphere or province. There are creatures in heaven, on earth, under the earth, and in the sea. Both Daniel's and John's beasts were derived from the same planetary archetypes of the polar configuration. However, these same symbolic beasts were used quite differently and signified substantially different meanings. The primary distinctions between the beasts of John and Daniel were of timing and location. John saw beasts in heaven representing future events, while Daniel saw beasts on earth representing historical kingdoms, albeit the future from Daniel's point of reference. Joseph Smith plainly taught that what John saw in his vision, including the 4 beasts, lay in futurity. Nothing in John's revelation, according to Joseph, except for minor exceptions made explicit by John, should be construed to be historical in nature. Joseph cited the very first verse of the Apocalypse to support his claim. Daniel's beasts, on the other hand, represented the kingdoms of the world throughout its history. Joseph referred to the angel's interpretation of the beast given to Daniel and recorded by him. John saw beasts which were in heaven. Daniel saw beasts pertaining to the earth. Both sets of beasts reflected their sphere and nature. John's beasts were lofty and angelic. Daniel's beasts were degenerate forms, representative of the beastly and savage nature of the kingdoms of the earth. This particular usage of beast was not limited to Daniel. Other prophets used these archetypal beasts to symbolize the degeneracy of man and his terrestrial kingdoms. According to Joseph, the Lord through his prophets never used the symbol of a beast to characterize the heavenly kingdom. According to John's record, it was the four beasts that unleashed the famous four horsemen of the apocalypse. While it was the Lamb who opened the seals, it was the beast which called forth the horsemen. According to Joseph Smith, the beasts and the horsemen were the same. While John records that the horsemen were the agents of the destruction of the earth, Joseph Smith explained that it was the beasts who performed that role. Joseph further explains that the four beasts acted as angelic beings due to their exalted and perfected state. In other words, like the seven destroying angels described by John later in his record, the beasts were four destroying angels given power to devour or destroy the earth. It may seem contradictory for Joseph to claim that the beasts and horsemen were one and the same, while John clearly makes them different. However, the archetypes of the polar configuration allow for such an interpretation. In an earlier episode in this series, we made the point that the four horses of Zechariah were four spirits of the heaven, going forth at the request of the Lord of hosts to destroy the earth. These four sets of colored horses, the same as John's horses, were spirits. The archetype for these spirit horses were the four plasma jets of Venus. The streamers, as we have noted, represented both animals like the colored horses and spirits like the seven spirits of heaven. The archetype of four streamers represented the four sets of horses in Zechariah and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They also form the basis for the four beasts surrounding the throne. Symbolically speaking, Joseph was correct. There is no distinction between horse, spirit, or beast in the original archetype. The task given the four beasts, or the four horsemen, required tremendous power, power sufficient to destroy 1/4 of the earth. Power of this magnitude requires faith of a commensurate magnitude. Enoch had such power, power that required tremendous faith. The four beasts required a similar amount of faith to fulfill their assignment as destroying angels. The power given them could only have come according to the faith they exercised. Faith is a principle of power for man and beast.